The early morning mist clung to the bars of the enclosures at Jackson Zoo, a crumbling sanctuary that once echoed with the sounds of life. Now, it was falling apart, suffocated under the weight of unpaid bills, dwindling visitors, and the merciless march of time. The animals had become burdens, and the largest burden of all was Arla. She had been the pride of the zoo once, a magnificent brown bear with deep, knowing eyes and a thick coat that shimmered in the sunlight. She had drawn crowds for years, standing on her hind legs, catching fish in her pond, and nuzzling the glass when children pressed their fingers against it. But the children had stopped coming, and so had the money. Jackson stood outside her enclosure, hands buried in the pockets of his weathered coat, watching her. Arla was not alone. Her two cubs, small and fumbling, curled against her in the hay. Their tiny ears twitched at every unfamiliar sound. They trusted her, and she trusted him. A dull ache throbbed at the back of Jackson's skull. Trust was a dangerous thing. The decision had been made. There was no room for emotion, no room for guilt. That night, when the moon hung low and the last staff member had left, Jackson worked in silence. He moved through the zoo like a ghost, his breath visible in the cold air. He carried a coil of thick rope, rough and frayed, the kind used to secure heavy cargo. His boots crunched against the gravel as he approached Arla's enclosure. She lifted her head at his presence, her eyes reflecting the dim glow of his flashlight. There was no fear in her, only familiarity. He had been the one to bottle feed her when she was a cub. He had been the one to stroke her fur when she was sick. She rose slowly, towering over him, and then leaned down, pressing her nose against the bars. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a chunk of raw meat, laced with sedatives. Arla took it without hesitation. It took only minutes for her to grow drowsy. Her movements became sluggish, her body heavy. The cubs, confused, pawed at her side, emitting tiny squeaks of concern. Jackson forced himself to look away as he unlocked the enclosure. His hands trembled as he stepped inside. He worked quickly, looping the rope around Arla's front legs, then her back. The cubs watched him, blinking, their small paws stepping hesitantly forward. They did not yet understand. He swallowed hard, tried to ignore the way one of them nuzzled against his boot, as if seeking reassurance. He loaded them into the truck, Arla's sedated body first, then the cubs, who he placed inside a crate. The drive was long, the road winding, leading deep into the heart of the forest where the trees stretched endlessly, their silhouettes looming like silent sentinels. The truck's tires skidded against the dirt road as Jackson pulled to a stop. The darkness was suffocating here, untouched by street lights or the hum of civilization. Only the distant sounds of owls and rustling leaves disturbed the silence. He climbed out, opening the back of the truck. Arla stirred weakly, but the sedatives held her down. The cubs whimpered inside the crate, pressing against the wooden slats. Jackson clenched his jaw and got to work. He dragged Arla out first, the ropes cutting into his palms as he pulled her toward a thick oak tree. The weight of her body made it difficult, but he had to finish before the sedatives wore off. He fastened the ropes around the trunk, binding her tightly. Her breathing was labored, her body twitching as she tried to wake up. Then the cubs. Jackson hesitated for the first time as he opened the crate. They were so small, so fragile. Their eyes were wide, glistening with innocence, unaware of what was happening. One of them let out a tiny, helpless cry, searching for its mother. His stomach twisted. He forced himself to lift them, tying them to a separate tree just a few feet away from Arla. They wriggled against the restraints, their tiny claws scraping at the bark. Arla groaned, a low, pain sound that sent a shiver down Jackson's spine. She was waking up. The finality of his actions settled over him like a lead weight. The bear who had once trusted him with her life was now trapped, abandoned in a place she did not know, sentenced to a slow death. The cubs, too young to fend for themselves, would not survive without her. The thought nearly paralyzed him. He forced himself to step back, his breath coming in short gasps. He turned, marching toward the truck with hurried steps, not allowing himself to look back. The forest was already swallowing them, the darkness thickening, the sounds of their muffled cries blending with the wind. Jackson climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel until his knuckles turned white. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. He turned the key. The engine roared to life. The headlights illuminated the trees ahead, casting long shadows. For a moment, he saw them. Arla, struggling weakly against the ropes, her cubs mewling at her side. A lump formed in his throat. Then, he pressed the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, tires kicking up dirt and gravel. The forest blurred past him, and soon, there was nothing but the road ahead. Nothing but silence behind. Pain. It was the first thing Arla felt as consciousness returned. A sharp, biting pain coiled around her limbs, burning, pressing, tightening. The rough fibers of the rope dug into her fur, cutting into the skin beneath. Every movement sent a fresh wave of agony through her body, yet the pain was nothing compared to what she heard next. Her cubs. Their cries were soft, trembling, barely audible over the wind rustling through the trees. The sound sliced through the fog in her mind, igniting a surge of panic that overpowered every ache and weakness in her body. She tried to move, but the restraints held fast, unyielding. She twisted her body, feeling the cruel pull of the ropes tightening against her. Her muscles strained, but the bindings refused to give. The air around her was thick with the scent of damp earth, rotting leaves, and something else, fear. Not just her own, but her cubs. They were waiting for her. She could hear them shifting, their tiny claws scratching at the bark of the tree where they had been tied. Their whimpers were full of confusion, trust, desperation. They didn't understand why she wasn't beside them, why she wasn't comforting them, protecting them. They needed her, and she would not fail them. Arla jerked her head, forcing herself to ignore the burning pain that shot through her body. She stretched her neck, twisting, struggling until her sharp teeth found purchase on the thick, knotted rope binding her front legs. The taste of dirt and fibers filled her mouth as she bit down, sinking her fangs deep into the strands. She pulled. The rope resisted, tough and thick, but she did not stop. She could feel the coarse material scraping against her gums, tearing them, the taste of blood mixing with the filth in her mouth. Her jaw ached, her teeth felt as if they might crack, but she kept going. Bite, rip, bite, rip, she growled, deep and low, frustration boiling in her chest. She could not fail. Not now. Not when her cubs were waiting for her. Not when every second wasted was another second they were left defenseless in the cold, cruel wilderness. Her claws scraped against the ground as she wrenched her body forward, yanking, twisting, anything to weaken the bindings. The rope dug deeper, cutting off circulation, sending sharp jolts of pain through her limbs. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but she refused to stop. Then, a snap. The fibers frayed, splitting, breaking. A sudden rush of movement sent her tumbling forward, the momentum slamming her onto the hard earth. For a moment, she lay still, panting, her limbs weak and shaking. But she had no time to recover. Her cubs. She lifted her head, forcing herself onto her trembling legs. Her paws were unsteady, her body still reeling from the sedatives that had been forced into her. The world tilted slightly, but she shook it off, stumbling toward the tree where her cubs were bound. They squirmed at the sight of her, their small faces lighting up with relief. Their cries grew more frantic, more pleading. They did not understand what had happened, only that their mother had returned, and they needed her more than ever. Arla wasted no time. She bit down on the first rope, the fibers already damp from the cub's struggles. She worked quickly, tearing through the restraints, her desperation making her movements faster, more precise. Within moments, the first cub was free. The tiny bear tumbled forward, immediately pressing its shivering body against her leg. Arla didn't pause. She turned to the second cub, repeating the same frantic process. Her jaws ached, her gums throbbed, but she didn't care. Snap! The second cub was free. They were safe. For now. Arla nudged them both forward, her body shielding them as she glanced around. The darkness of the forest stretched endlessly in all directions, swallowing everything beyond a few feet. There was no shelter here, no food, no warmth, only trees and shadows. She had to move. With one final glance at the place where she had nearly been left to die, she turned, pushing her cubs ahead of her. They stumbled, their legs still weak from being bound, but they followed. They trusted her. They always had. The air grew colder as they moved deeper into the wilderness. The wind howled through the trees, biting at her exposed skin, seeping into the wounds left by the ropes. Each step was agony, her body screaming for rest, but she could not afford to stop. The cubs whimpered behind her, their exhaustion clear. They were too young for this, too small. Their tiny bodies trembled with each gust of wind, their noses lifting in search of warmth that did not exist. Hunger clawed at her belly. It had been too long since she had eaten. Her body was weakening, the lack of food making every movement slower, every decision harder. The cubs needed milk, but her own body was drained, empty. She needed to find food, water, shelter, anything, but there was nothing. Only the endless maze of trees, stretching higher, blocking the moonlight, wrapping the forest in an eerie, suffocating darkness. Every shadow felt like a threat, every rustling leaf a predator waiting to strike. She had never felt this vulnerable. She pressed forward, her breaths coming in heavy, uneven bursts. The cubs trailed close behind, their tiny paws crunching against the frozen earth. She could hear their stomachs growling, their whimpers growing weaker. They would not last long like this. Neither would she. She had always been strong, a survivor, but she had never faced a world like this. A world where she had no protection, no safety, nowhere to run except into more unknown dangers. The ground beneath her paws shifted, damp and unstable. A thin layer of frost covered the earth, numbing her already aching limbs. The trees creaked, groaning under the weight of the wind. The cubs huddled closer. She wished she could give them warmth. She wished she could tell them it would be okay. But she could not lie. Not here. Not now. The wilderness did not care for wishes. It cared only for survival. And Arla had no choice but to fight for it. The night was merciless. The cold wrapped around Arla and her cubs like a silent predator, gnawing at their bones, stealing what little warmth they had left. The forest was endless, stretching in all directions, offering neither shelter nor safety. Each step was agony, her paws raw from the frozen earth, her body weak from starvation. The cubs stumbled behind her, their small bodies shivering, their tiny cries growing softer with every passing hour. She nudged them forward, urging them to keep moving, but she knew they wouldn't last much longer. Then the scent came. It was thick, primal, unmistakable, a scent that sent every instinct in her body into a frenzy of alarm. Her ears twitched, her muscles tensed, and she froze. The air was suddenly heavy, thick with something unseen, something watching. The forest, which had been filled with the distant sounds of rustling leaves and the whisper of the wind, had gone silent. A silence so deep, so absolute, that it felt unnatural. Then the eyes appeared, yellow orbs in the darkness, glowing like embers in the night. One pair, then another, and another. They blinked slowly, shifting, moving, circling. Arla's heart pounded. A wolf pack. She pushed the cubs behind her, planting her paws firmly in the dirt. The wolves moved like ghosts, their steps soundless, their bodies blending into the shadows. She bared her teeth, her breath coming in sharp, visible bursts in the freezing air. Her cubs whimpered, pressing into her, their tiny bodies trembling with fear. The wolves did not attack. They moved closer, slow and deliberate, their eyes locked on her. They were testing her, measuring her strength, deciding if she was prey. She let out a deep, rumbling growl, warning them that she would fight to the death if she had to. Then, from the darkness, one wolf stepped forward. He was larger than the others, his fur streaked with scars, his golden eyes unreadable. The alpha. His presence alone commanded obedience, The rest of the pack stilled, waiting for his signal. But he did not give it. He simply stood there, watching her. Arla did not move. She held his gaze, refusing to back down. She could feel her cubs shaking against her legs, could hear their tiny, frightened breaths. She knew the rules of the wild. The weak did not survive. The weak were killed. The alpha took a step closer. She braced herself. Then, without a sound, he turned and vanished into the trees. The pack hesitated, some wolves shifting forward, their instincts screaming at them to attack, to kill, to feast. But they did not move without the alpha's command, and he had given none. One by one, the wolves melted back into the darkness. But Arla knew they were still there, watching, waiting. She did not lower her guard. The cubs clung to her, their small bodies pressed in her fur, their tiny paws gripping the earth beneath them. She listened, her ears twitching at every sound, but the forest remained silent. She was not safe. Not yet. The days passed, each one blending into the next. The hunger did not fade. It grew. It twisted inside her, a relentless torment that would not be ignored. The cubs had stopped crying for food. They no longer had the energy. They only huddled close to her, their tiny bodies too weak to do anything else. She needed a hunt, but the wolves were always there. They followed her, appearing in the distance, flickering like shadows between the trees. She did not know why. They did not attack, yet they did not leave. They were waiting for something. She did not know what. She tracked a rabbit through the snow, her body low, her movements slow, every muscle tense with anticipation. It was small, barely enough for one meal, but it would keep her cubs alive for another day. She tensed, ready to strike. Then, just as she lunged, a blur of fur, a wolf. It struck first, faster than she had ever seen, its powerful jaws snapping the rabbit's neck in an instant. Arla skidded to a stop, her breath ragged, her heart hammering in her chest. The wolf turned its head toward her. It was young, lean, its golden eyes unreadable. She waited, bracing herself for the fight, for the inevitable struggle over the kill. But the wolf did not attack. It hesitated. Then, slowly, it dropped the rabbit. It stood there for a moment, then turned and disappeared into the forest. Arla did not waste a second. She lunged forward, snatching the rabbit in her jaws before another predator could take it. She carried it back to the cubs, their tired eyes lighting up at the sight of food. She tore it apart, giving them the softest pieces, watching as their tiny bodies absorbed the warmth of their first meal in days. The wolves were still watching, but for the first time, she did not sense hostility. This was not an attack. This was a test she had passed. Time moved strangely after that. The wolves never left. They watched from a distance, their glowing eyes ever present, but they no longer crept closer with the intent to kill. She hunted, and they did not interfere. She rested, and they did not drive her away. She did not know what she had become to them. A trespasser, a guest, a curiosity, but she was not prey. Her cubs no longer flinched when they saw the wolves in the distance. They had grown used to them, to the silent figures that never came closer, yet never left. The alpha still kept his distance, but he was always there, watching, waiting. For what? She did not know, but she would. And when the time came, she would be ready. The days blurred together in an endless fight for survival. The forest was both enemy and teacher, cruel in its lessons yet necessary in its demands. Arla had no choice but to adapt. There was no safety net, no protection, no warm enclosure or daily meals. Hunger clawed at her stomach, but there was no room for weakness. Her cubs depended on her. She learned quickly. The first hunts were failures, humiliating in their inefficiency. Her body, still weakened from captivity, was too slow, her strikes too clumsy. The hares darted away before her claws could catch them. The deer sensed her presence long before she could get close. She was starving, and so were her cubs. Their whimpers in the dead of night sent a deep pain through her chest, but she could not give up. She scavenged what she could, tearing apart frozen carcasses left behind by other predators. The wolves were always near, always watching. Sometimes they would take what they wanted and leave nothing but bones, but sometimes they let her take what remained. It wasn't enough. Her body craved fresh meat. Her cubs needed more than scraps. She became more patient. She learned to move quietly, to let the forest mask her presence. Her body, once sluggish from captivity, grew stronger. The thick coat that had once only shielded her from wind now camouflaged her within the trees. Her senses sharpened. She studied the movements of the deer, the way they hesitated before lowering their heads to drink, the way their ears flicked at the smallest sound. She learned when to strike and, more importantly, when to wait. The first time she brought down prey on her own, the kill was messy. The deer had fought harder than she expected, kicking wildly, nearly escaping. Her cubs had watched from the shadows, their tiny bodies tensed with hunger and fear. But when she finally sank her teeth into its throat, when the struggling stopped, when the warm scent of fresh blood filled the air, she had won. Her cubs ate greedily, their small bodies pressing against hers as they tore into the flesh. For the first time since their escape, their bellies were full. Arla licked the blood from their fur, feeling something strange rise within her. Pride. She had done this. She had kept them alive. But the wilderness did not allow rest. With food came another challenge, shelter. The winter winds were brutal, slicing through the trees, bringing storms that turned the ground to ice and filled the air with blinding snow. The cubs huddled close to her, their tiny bodies trembling, their fur not yet thick enough to withstand the bitter cold. She needed a den. She searched for days, pushing her body past exhaustion, sniffing out old burrows, caves, anything that could offer protection. Many were already claimed. Foxes, badgers, other predators had taken refuge before her. She fought when she had to, driving out smaller creatures, though she was careful not to waste too much energy. Then she found it, a hollow beneath a fallen tree, its roots forming a natural barricade against the wind. It was not perfect, but it was theirs. She clawed at the earth, widening the space, making it warmer, safer. The cubs curled up inside, their small bodies finally finding rest in the warmth of packed earth and dried leaves. She stood guard at the entrance, her breath visible in the freezing air, ears twitching at every sound. She was stronger now, but the wild had no mercy for those who let their guard down. The wolves came again, their presence a familiar shadow in the night. She smelled them before she saw them, their scent woven into the fabric of the forest. They no longer hid from her. They walked openly now, their yellow eyes flickering in the darkness. The alpha stood at the edge of the trees, watching. Arla did not move. She had proven herself. She had killed. She had survived. The wolves would not chase her away. She lifted her head, staring back at the alpha, unafraid. And he turned, not in dismissal, not in rejection. He turned as if acknowledging something unspoken, something decided. The rest of the pack followed, disappearing into the trees. They had accepted her. She was no longer an intruder. She was something else. Her cubs were growing. Their legs were stronger, their movements more confident. They chased one another through the snow, learning the way the wild worked. They watched her when she hunted, mimicking her movements, practicing their own clumsy strikes. The world was harsh, but they were adapting. Arla had thought captivity had made her weak, that the years spent behind bars had stolen something from her. But she was wrong. The wild had not broken her. It had made her whole again. The scent of humans came long before Arla saw them. It was unnatural, sharp, filled with the acrid stench of smoke, metal, and sweat. The forest itself seemed to recoil from their presence, the usual sounds of rustling leaves and distant birds falling eerily silent. Arla's ears flicked back, her muscles tensing as she lifted her head to the wind. This was not the scent of passing travelers or lost wanderers. This was something far worse. She nudged her cubs toward the shelter of the dense undergrowth, urging them to stay hidden. They obeyed without question, sensing the shift in her posture, the sudden urgency in her movements. Their instincts were developing, but they were still too young, too small. If the humans found them, they would not survive. The wolves sensed it too. The pack had been resting near the trees, their bodies blending into the frost-covered earth. Now, they were alert, their golden eyes flickering with tension. The alpha stood motionless, ears pricked, his body rigid. Arla could feel the unspoken understanding between them. The humans were a threat to them all. Then came a first sound, a distant crack. Not the natural snap of a branch beneath careless paws, but something deliberate, something dangerous. Arla had heard that sound once before, long ago, when humans had come to take her from the wild and imprison her behind bars. A gunshot. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The wolves stirred uneasily. Some lowered their bodies to the ground, prepared to run. Others bared their teeth, uncertain whether to flee or fight. The alpha remained still, his gaze fixed on the unseen danger beyond the trees. Arla made her decision. She had spent too long as prey. She would not be hunted again. She let out a low growl, stepping forward, away from her cubs, away from the wolves. The pack watched her, the alpha tilting his head slightly, but he did not stop her. He understood. Another gunshot echoed through the trees. Closer this time. Then voices. Rough, human voices, low and impatient. Arla could not understand their words, but she recognized the tone. She had heard voices like these before, back when men in uniforms had come to inspect her cage, back when their voices had meant danger. She moved carefully, her massive body slipping between the trees with surprising silence. The forest had taught her how to move unseen, how to become part of the shadows. She followed the scent, the voices drawing closer until she saw them. 3 men. Their clothing was thick, layered, blending into the surroundings, but their scent betrayed them. They carried weapons, long, metal things that glinted in the fading daylight. Their faces were partially hidden beneath rough beards and scarves, their breath visible in the cold air. One of them knelt, examining the ground. Tracking. They were searching for something. For her. For the wolves. A fresh wave of fury burned through her. These men were not lost hunters looking for food. They were something else entirely. They were here to kill. She had to stop them. Arla took a slow step back, her mind racing. She could not fight them directly. She had seen what guns could do, but she could lead them away. She let out a low, guttural huff, loud enough to be heard, but not so aggressive as to immediately provoke an attack. The men stiffened, their heads snapping toward the sound. There, one of them barked. She turned and ran. Not toward her cubs, not toward the wolves. She ran toward the thickest part of the forest, the deepest snow, the most treacherous terrain she could find. The men followed. She could hear their footsteps, the crunch of snow beneath their heavy boots, the muttered curses as they stumbled over roots and uneven ground. She was faster, but she could not outrun bullets. A sharp crack split the air, and a tree just inches from her shoulder exploded into splinters. She snarled, veering sharply, using the terrain to her advantage, weaving between trees too thick for them to shoot through. The men shouted to each other, their voices growing frustrated. Another shot. This time it whizzed past her ear, missing only because she had turned at the last second. She needed a plan. And then she saw it. A frozen river, slick with ice, its surface covered in a deceptive layer of fresh snow. She knew the land. They did not. She pushed forward, her paws careful as she reached the riverbank. She pretended to stumble, kicking up snow, making it seem as if she had lost control. Then, with a final push, she leapt across, landing safely on the other side. The men were too focused on catching her to think. They ran onto the ice. The first man barely had time to shout before the surface beneath him cracked. Then, in an instant, it gave way. A splash. A scream. The second man skidded to a stop just in time, barely avoiding the same fate, but the distraction was enough. Arla turned, disappearing into the trees before they could fire another shot. She did not stop running. Not until the gunshots had faded. Not until the scent of humans was far behind. Only then did she circle back, making sure the trail she left was confused, impossible to follow. When she finally returned to the place where she had left her cubs, they were still hidden, their small bodies pressed into the shelter of the undergrowth. The wolves were there too. The alpha stood watching her, silent as ever. Arla met his gaze. She had done what she had to do. She had saved them. The humans would not return. Not tonight, but they would come again. And next time, she would be ready. The forest had changed, or perhaps it had not. And it was Arla who had become something new, something stronger, something unbreakable. She moved through the endless trees with a quiet confidence now, no longer hesitating at the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness or flinching at the distant howls in the night. She had come to know the rhythms of the land, the whispers carried by the wind, the hidden dangers woven into the scent of the earth. The sharp cold of winter no longer stole the breath from her lungs. The hunger that had once gnawed relentlessly at her belly no longer dictated her every step. She had learned. She had adapted. She had survived. Her cubs had grown, their small, fragile bodies now sturdy, their once clumsy steps now steady and sure. They no longer shivered from the cold but embraced it, no longer whimpered for food but sought it, no longer followed blindly but moved with instinct, their young minds absorbing everything she had taught them. They chased each other through the undergrowth, their paws kicking up snow as they tumbled together in playful combat, practicing for the battles that would one day ensure their survival. They had inherited her strength, her will, her relentless drive to endure. They were no longer helpless cubs born into a world that did not want them to survive. They were creatures of the wild now, just as she had become, and the wolves had come to accept them. It had not happened suddenly, nor all at once. The pack had watched her, studied her, tested her in ways she had not always understood. They had waited for weakness, for hesitation, for any sign that she did not belong. But Arla had never faltered. She had hunted with them, not as a thief stealing from their land, but as a force just as fierce, just as deserving of what the wilderness provided. She had defended her cubs, defended herself, stood her ground when they had expected her to run. And in time, the space between them had closed. The golden-eyed wolves that had once been only silent shadows now ran alongside her, their presence no longer a threat, but an understanding. She was not one of them, not truly, but she was no longer an outsider. She was something more. The alpha no longer regarded her with suspicion, no longer kept his distance as though waiting for her to prove herself again. He had accepted her place among them, acknowledged what she had become. She had seen it in the way he moved past her without hesitation, in the way he let his young approach her cubs without fear, in the way he no longer stood between her and the pack, but instead allowed her to move among them freely. It was not submission, not dominance, but respect. Arla had never known such a thing. She had once belonged to a world of metal bars and locked gates, where hands that did not understand her had dictated her existence, where food was given without effort, where survival was ensured but life was hollow. They had called it care, called it safety, but it had been a prison all the same. She had been a spectacle, something to be observed, something to be contained. She had known no hunger, no struggle, no fear of the elements, but she had known nothing of the world that had always been meant to be hers. And now, she knew everything. She knew the scent of a coming storm before the clouds darkened the sky, knew the sound of a hare's heartbeat buried beneath the snow, knew the paths the deer took when they moved between the trees at dawn. She knew where to find water when the rivers froze, where to take shelter when the winds howled, how to keep her cubs safe when danger loomed. She knew how to live, not as a caged animal, not as a creature observed from the outside, but as something wild, something free, something untamed. Her cubs were ready now. She could see it in the way they carried themselves, in the way they no longer flinched at the unfamiliar, in the way they no longer looked to her for every answer. They had learned from her, from the land, from the wolves who had unknowingly become their teachers as well. They no longer feared the world beyond the safety of their mother's side. She had given them that. She had given them everything. One morning, as the sun stretched long golden beams through the skeletal branches of the trees, she caught a scent that made her body tense, her breath still in her chest. It was faint, barely there beneath the layers of damp earth and frost, but she knew it well. It had been so long since she had smelled it, so long since it had meant anything to her. Metal, oil, rust. She followed it, her steps slow, her muscles coiled, her breath moving in steady bursts. The wolves had scented it too, their ears pricking, their heads turning towards something half-buried in the snow. A trap. Old, rusted, forgotten, its sharp teeth concealed beneath a thin layer of ice. It had been here for a long time, left behind, abandoned, its purpose unfulfilled. But it did not matter how long it had been waiting. It had been built for only one reason: to capture, to imprison, to take. Arla stared at it, her breath a slow cloud against the frozen air. She remembered the metal bars of her cage, the cold, unyielding floor beneath her, the hands that had closed doors behind her and left her there. She remembered the eyes of the humans who had looked at her, fascinated, entertained, but never truly seeing her. This was what they had always wanted. This was what they had always believed she should be. A thing to be kept, a thing to be controlled, a thing to be owned. But they had failed. She had not only escaped, she had won. With one powerful swipe of her claws, she sent the trap flying, flipping it onto its side, its rusted hinges snapping, its broken teeth sinking uselessly into the snow. It would never hold another living thing. She turned away from it, her gaze lifting to the vast expanse of the wild around her, to the world that had once been denied to her, but had now become hers completely. She thought of the cubs she had raised, the wolves who had become her allies, the life she had built in a place that had tried to reject her. She had come from captivity, from weakness, from a life that had sought to contain her. Now, she had a family. Now, she had a home. Now, she had something greater than survival. She had freedom.